Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Telos' First Principle. Have you ever wondered why human beings are paradoxically more intelligent than other animals in many ways, while also more prone to stupidity and insanity? Why is it that human beings struggle with all kinds of mental illnesses while other animals almost never do, unless their habitat's been destroyed or they're locked up in zoos? In this video, I want to talk about how our large brain and intelligence is not only an advantage, but also a liability. My hope is that in understanding this, it'll help you to harness your own human intelligence and not let it hijack you into stupidity or poor mental health. To understand this, we'll consider the evolution of the human brain. There's a reason it got so large and expanded our intelligence. This will also help us understand what can sometimes happen when that intelligence drifts too far from the functions it evolved to serve. Most of us rarely, if ever, look at and feel our body and experience it as the culmination of an evolutionary process that began with single-cell organisms approximately 3.8 billion years ago. Nor do we recognize that our emotions, thoughts, dreams, fears, relational experiences, and our very consciousness emerged from the same process. We're here in body and mind because of an unbroken chain of life. Our bodies and brains are the product of adaptation to our earlier environments, aquatic, terrestrial, and social. The environments that we live in and adapt to now are radically different from the ones that we evolved in. Our brains and bodies know this, but our conscious minds don't have a clue. We simply accept the world that we're in and do our best to adapt to it. Many of us have a deep intuition that something just ain't right. We feel a mismatch between what we are made for and the world we're confronted by and have to navigate. To take this long perspective on our lives and to sense it in our own bodies and minds, I believe can be as profound and life-changing as the experience that astronauts describe when viewing the Earth from space. So let's explore an important part of that evolutionary story. The strongest theory is that our brains became larger primarily to handle the complexity of life in social groups. For humans, these groups were larger, more emotionally nuanced, and more interdependent than those of any other species. According to what's known as the social brain hypothesis, it wasn't primarily tool-making or abstract reasoning that demanded bigger brains. It was the challenge of living in increasingly large and complex social groups. It's widely theorized that the prefrontal cortex evolved to manage this in groups of up to 150 members. It's true that many animals live in groups, wolves, elephants, dolphins, and birds among them. But human social life became uniquely complex for specific evolutionary reasons. Our ancestors didn't just live together, they depended on each other to survive in ways that no other species did. Hunting, food sharing, cooperative child rearing, and cultural transmission made flexible cooperation not just helpful, but essential. Those able to do this had a survival advantage, and overall, these pressures formed a self-reinforcing loop. The more we relied on each other, the more cognition we needed, and the more cognition we had, the more interdependent we became, and the larger our brain became. So while group size played a primary role in brain evolution, it was the depth and complexity of human relationships and the symbolic communication required for social coordination that truly set our species apart. Okay, so that helps to explain why our brains grew large to confer more cognitive powers. Now let's consider this in the context of earlier and later phases of cognitive development. In other words, what was the larger social brain and cognitive power built on top of, and where did it go next? The evolution of the brain and cognitive development are complex topics. Hopefully it'll be obvious that I'm just giving a broad brushstroke description of major pieces of the puzzle. I won't be unpacking Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, nor Lev Vygotsky's disagreements with Piaget. Nor will I be talking about the many additional developmental theories that have emerged in the past 50 years. I'll focus instead on four primary stages in the evolution of human intelligence. The first and most ancient layer is what's called sensory motor intelligence. You see this in reptiles, a direct, embodied responsiveness to the environment, survival instincts such as fight, flight, and freeze. There's very little emotional intelligence at this stage, just raw interaction with the physical world. This is also the foundation of human intelligence. But with the emergence of mammals and other social species, intelligence takes on further functions. Next, we see the development of emotional intelligence. The limbic system allows for maternal care, bonding, play, and social memory. Emotions serve to regulate relationships. They motivate care, signal danger, and build trust. Emotional intelligence builds on and is the next stage after sensory motor intelligence. Following on from emotional intelligence is social intelligence. All social animals have some degree of social intelligence, which draws on and is rooted in emotional intelligence. But for humans, this became highly developed to form stable relationships with dozens of others. This helped us in tracking who is allied with who has wronged who can be trusted, who's watching, who might lie, who needs help. The pressures to maintain group cohesion, cooperation, and subtle interpersonal negotiation demanded more cognitive power than solitary survival ever did. And once our brains were large and socially sophisticated, something else emerged: abstract thinking. I'll be saying much more about this later, as it's the key turning point that both confers great advantages and risks. It turns out that along with all of its miraculous benefits, it's allowed us to veer far from the matrix of life. So, we can see that starting with the evolution of a nervous system, intelligence has developed through four stages. Each is rooted in and builds upon the one before. We start with sensory motor intelligence that orients us and allows us to navigate the physical world. Then for social animals, emotional intelligence evolved to allow us to feel, bond, and respond to and cooperate with a number of others. Then on top of this, social intelligence emerged to allow social animals to track and understand more complex relationships within larger groups. Finally, we humans became capable of abstract thought. It's believed that abstraction emerged with the advent of spoken language. We no longer had to point at things that were present. We had symbols and concepts to communicate about things not immediate in space and time, which was tremendously helpful for coordinating our collective activities. I've been calling these stages, but I prefer to think of them as phases that blend into and build upon each other rather than distinct stages. Human cognition developed in layers, each one resting on and shaped by what came before. While Piaget contributed greatly to our understanding of cognitive development from infancy to adulthood in humans, he had little to say about emotional intelligence. However, neuroscience and evolutionary biology recognize emotional intelligence as an important additional capacity in the evolutionary journey, so I'm including it as a major stage of intelligence. Before exploring the liabilities of abstract thinking, let's acknowledge its advantages. With the advent of symbolic communication to serve social cohesion and collaboration, we gained an abstract understanding that could be applied to and serve our sensory motor, emotional, and social needs. At least this is where it started. This gave rise to four main categories of inventions, all of which served various adaptive needs. Physical tools such as fire, the spear, the wheel, the plow, electricity, the automobile, and the computer. We invented symbolic tools such as spoken and written language, money, clock time, and calendars. We invented abstract systems or mental models such as mythologies, astrology, the scientific method, and logic. And we created social inventions such as nations, religions, institutions, ethics, and law. The advantages conferred in each of these four areas are vast, and I can only begin to describe them. As for physical tools, Abstract thinking allowed us to envision tools before they existed, to imagine a better grip, a faster wheel, a more efficient engine. This capacity to plan, design, and refine in the mind's eye led to extraordinary extensions of human capability. We could hunt more effectively, travel farther, perform complex surgeries, and eventually shape entire environments to suit our needs. Tools became externalized extensions of our intentions. Symbolic inventions enabled us to represent value, time, and obligations in compact, transferable forms. With money, we could trade beyond the immediate and the perishable. With clocks, we could meet at specific times. With calendars, we could coordinate planting, migration, and celebrations. These inventions allowed life to scale collaborative activities beyond memory, kinship, and immediacy. The invention of conceptual systems and mental models. Beyond symbolic representation, conceptual systems or mental models made it possible to think about the world systematically, to map the stars, test hypotheses, and trace cause and effect across time. Whether in astrology or astronomy, myth, or scientific method, we developed conceptual frameworks to explain reality and anticipate outcomes. This gave us not only predictive power, but a sense of coherence and orientation in an otherwise bewildering world. And abstract thinking allowed us to create social inventions. Perhaps most profoundly, allowed us to imagine ourselves as part of something larger, a tribe, a religion, a nation, and a moral order represented in institutions of law and justice. This bound us together through shared stories, rituals, symbols, and ideals. It gave meaning to suffering, offered guidance for behavior, and made large-scale cooperation possible among strangers. So obviously, the capacity for abstract thinking has served many purposes for human life. It's indisputable. What I want to explore now, however, is the shadow side of all of these advantages, or what is sometimes called the dialectic of progress. What happens if those abstract capacities become detached and dissociated from the functions the earlier phases evolved to serve and the living systems in which they are embedded? Over time, our abstract capacities have drifted both from earlier phases and the context of living systems. We've dissociated, not just as individuals, but as a species, not because abstraction's bad, but because it became unmoored from its roots and its context. As I see it, the problem begins when we reify our abstract concepts and mental models and take them to be primary and more real than the phenomenal world. The great sense of control we've gained as a civilization through our abstract thinking can and has led us to ignore and dissociate from natural feedback loops, from the sensory, motor, emotional, and social dimensions of our experience. This feedback is what could and ought to give us pause, to check our map against the territory and make corrections when we veer too far from what serves life. Our concepts allow us to categorize everything in our world, and we're lured into believing that our representations tell us all we need to know. We stop using our senses, including tactile contact, for observing and knowing things directly. We believe we know what a tree is, for instance, because we have a concept for it. But most of us know very little about the miraculous complexity of trees or their ecological functions. We reduce them to the value of lumber, or as an obstacle to farming. Trees become just part of an economic equation, and that's just trees. We've concepts and mental models for everything, and each abstraction we reify can potentially eclipse our direct contact with the world. The necessary cognitive function of simplification comes at a potential cost. The more I've contemplated the liabilities of abstract thinking, the more overwhelmingly complex it seems to me, just like the world itself. Ironically, I can't even contemplate this without abstract thinking, nor can I communicate anything to you about its risks without concepts and mental models. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that everything I say could be reified and held too tightly. Please consider what I say as merely signposts for regions on a map or territory, that must be navigated directly in person. That said, here's my proposal for how to recognize and think about the risks of abstract thinking. I propose that we consider the 4 kinds of inventions that abstract thinking made possible and pick just one from each kind. I'll suggest the consequences of reification and dissociation for each one. I will not be advocating for the abolition of abstract thinking, a notion that could not arise in the first place without it. Let's think of abstract thinking as a very sharp knife that needs to be used skillfully to avoid cutting our fingers off. In fact, it can be very useful for helping us to solve the very problems itself creates. For instance, our dissociation from living contexts that is a result of reified abstractions can be addressed in large part by abstract systemic thinking. In other words, seeing things within their relational context. Or consider the abstract thinking required for ergonomic design when we recognize the negative impact on the body of furniture, tool use, work environments, and limited repetitive movements that cause things like carpal tunnel syndrome or back issues. So let's do it. Let's consider 4 human inventions made possible by abstract thinking and their risks. We'll start with a physical tool. I could talk about the printing press, the steam engine, or the automobile, but let's consider the screen, something we're all familiar with, from television to the computer. Being able to transmit and receive information across space and time obviously confers many advantages. But what are the risks? As our lives have moved onto screens, we've increasingly lost contact with the sensory motor intelligence that shaped us for millions of years. Visually, we've shrunk the world down to a 2-dimensional square and listen through headphones or speakers. We aren't always conscious that sound provides spatial orientation too, but it does. Our movement is confined to sitting still, and our proprioceptive awareness skills dull. Our eyes, once trained to scan a horizon or read subtle shifts in a person's face, are now fixed on backlit rectangles. The body, once a source of knowledge, becomes almost an afterthought. Emotionally, the screen flattens nuance. Texts and emojis stand in for tone, timing, and facial expression. Our nervous systems no longer co-regulate through presence and gesture, but through notification pings and curated images. We may feel connected, but often remain emotionally undernourished. Screens don't just display information. They're designed to capture and steer our emotional states. Algorithms on social media, news feeds, and video platforms are optimized to trigger emotional engagement, especially anger, outrage, envy, and fear, because heightened emotion increases time on the screen. And over time, we become emotionally conditioned by what the screen feeds us, often without noticing it. Our emotional responses are shaped not by lived relational experience, but by stimuli, curated for profit and attention. This can erode our capacity for emotional regulation, distort our worldview, and leave us vulnerable to manipulation, not through direct coercion, but through emotional engineering. Excessive time spent on the internet and social media is known to contribute to many mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, ADHD, loneliness, body image issues and eating disorders, addiction, and identity confusion. Screens offer the promise of connection, but the kind of connection they promote often lacks the depth, nuance, and embodied presence that real relationships require. In a digitally mediated world, we're more connected than ever, we think. Yet many people report a growing loneliness, disconnection, and a longing for real human contact. The problem is not that digital interaction is inherently bad. It's that it can substitute for, rather than support, the slow, vulnerable, and mutual work of in-person relationships. Also, socially, digital platforms sort us into ideological bubbles, reinforcing our own views and shielding us from meaningful contact with difference. These echo chambers flatten human complexity and promote a kind of tribalism that may feel satisfying in the short term, but is ill-suited to the demands of larger pluralistic societies. Conflict becomes moralized, nuance disappears, and the social fabric begins to fray. Perhaps nowhere is the distortion of social life more stark than in the world of online pornography. Here, the screen delivers a simulation of intimacy without any of the reciprocal work that real intimacy entails. Over time, this can condition a person to seek gratification without vulnerability, without dialogue, with care for the other. Relationships risk becoming transactional, performance-based, or emotionally bypassed. In extreme cases, attachment may become disoriented, wired toward screen-based stimulation rather than toward living, breathing people. Together, these forces, tribalism, pseudo-connection, and simulated intimacy, represent a profound risk. The gradual erosion of a capacity to belong to one another in an embodied way, in ways that matter most. Okay, let's talk about the symbolic invention of money. As a symbolic tool, money has enabled incredible expansion in trade, cooperation, and economic possibility. But precisely because money is so abstract, an agreed upon system of value, it allows for a decoupling between what a person does and the bodily and environmental context of that action and its eventual consequences. When our work is motivated solely by the pursuit of money, rather than by direct relationship to outcomes in the real world, the body often becomes secondary or even expendable. We find ourselves doing jobs that confine the body to narrow postures, repetitive motions, or long sedentary stretches. We adapt to work that happens in toxic or ergonomically damaging environments, often indoors under artificial light with little connection to fresh air, natural movement, or natural rhythm. Sleep, rest, and physical vitality can all be sacrificed in the name of productivity because money rewards output, not well-being. The abstract system doesn't register pain, fatigue, or subtle physical feedback. As long as the work gets done, the body's signals go unheard. At the same time, the sensory world we evolved to engage with, the rich textures of earth, water, animals, the weather, can be replaced by sterile, flattened environments. Many people work in spaces where the only tactile experience is plastic or glass, and the primary view is a screen. The work is done for the sake of money, but not in contact with life. And let's not forget that our economic activity can not only be damaging to our bodies, it's also transformed the planet in ways that damage ecological systems, the very foundations of life. Money, in abstracting value, often reshapes the way we relate to ourselves and others emotionally. It can narrow the range of what we recognize as meaningful or satisfying or valuable. When emotional needs such as security, love, purpose, or status become filtered through monetary terms, they risk being reduced in ways that eclipse deeper emotional needs. For example, a sense of self-worth may come to rest on income level rather than intrinsic human value or relational contributions. Fear and scarcity may dominate emotional life, not because there's no safety or security, but because abstract financial goals are never enough, especially when compared to others. Shame arises when one cannot produce or earn, regardless of the complexity or validity of their life circumstances or the other meaningful ways that they make contributions to others. Emotional numbing and deep despair can occur when work is disconnected from meaning and a sense of felt purpose, and driven solely by economic survival. This is a common complaint I hear often from many of my clients. Moreover, the pursuit of money often serves as a way of dealing with emotions we're culturally discouraged from naming. Instead of expressing grief, longing, or loneliness, people may work longer hours, buy more things, or measure life satisfaction by wealth accumulation. In this way, money doesn't just provide a means, it becomes a defense against vulnerability, and emotional literacy can atrophy. Socially, the abstraction of money risks decoupling human relationships from their lived, reciprocal, and embodied foundations. Traditional societies often operated through direct reciprocity, gifts, favors, shared labor, or food exchange. These systems embedded people in social and moral networks. While money enabled large-scale cooperation, also allows for transaction without relationship. We can pay someone to help us move, fix our home, care for our children, or even provide companionship without needing to know them, trust them, or care about them, or engage in embodied reciprocity. Social bonds become optional. When relationships are mediated by money, subtle distortions can emerge. We may come to value people based on their economic utility. Communities can fragment into classes based on income, where empathy is eroded by economic distance. Shared rituals, traditions, and collective meaning-making, which once bound people together, can get crowded out by market logic and individualized pursuits. In short, money enables freedom from traditional bonds, but without awareness, it can erode our capacity for deep and sustaining social relationships. Okay, now let's consider a tool, an invention in the abstract system or mental model category. Empirical science. It's one of humanity's greatest inventions, one that spawned countless other inventions. But when its methods are reified and they claim a monopoly on what is real and true and important, it can dissociate from other important modes of knowing. At the sensory motor level, science often privileges observation at a distance, measurement over direct embodied engagement. Quantification replaces participation. The scientific observer, imagined as detached and neutral, is estranged from the living system they study. The body becomes an object, not a source of understanding. Emotionally, scientific detachment can foster a stance of disengagement. Suffering becomes data. Compassion becomes a variable to be controlled. While this objectivity has its uses, it also risks blunting empathy. Some things, like grief, awe, and reverence, cannot be measured without losing vital information. When emotional intelligence is excluded, science loses part of its humanity. Socially, the authority of science can be misused to silence dissent or complexity. Lay people may defer blindly to experts or else reject them entirely. Either way, dialogue collapses. What's needed is not just trust in science, but some humility in the face of uncertainty and a recognition that no abstract system can fully capture lived experience. Contextually, scientific thinking can isolate variables so completely that systems thinking is lost. The forest becomes a set of trees, the organism becomes a machine, and when complex feedback systems, biological, ecological, and social, are reduced to single causes, we may intervene in ways that solve one problem while creating 10 more. Science can tell us how to create new technologies, but it can't answer the question of whether we should. To answer that question, we need emotional and social intelligence. In other words, we need ethics. For instance, consider the rapid development of AI due to market forces, in other words, money, without addressing the many ethical implications. Often our inventions work in tandem, both for good and bad. In this case, money and science. Finally, science has historically privileged left hemisphere modes of knowing, linearity, categorization, precision. But life, as Ian McGilchrist reminds us, is not a mechanism. It's a context-dependent flow of meaning. When we forget this, science can blind us to anything it can't explain in its own terms. All right, now we'll talk about a social invention, institutions. Institutions are the formalization of social structures. They give continuity, coordination, and identity for their members. But when institutions become rigid or self-preserving, they often drift from their original social purpose. Sensory motor dissociation can be subtle sometimes, but consider how institutions physically shape experience. Think of schools that restrict children's movements, during a period in their lives when they are very kinetically oriented. And this is especially true for boys. And consider modern hospitals. While they're life-saving, they can alienate patients from their own bodies by reducing them to medical objects, charts, scans, and diagnoses, rather than treating them as whole people. Patients often lose control over basic bodily routines like eating, sleeping, and movement, and must navigate sterile environments filled with harsh lights, machine noises, and unfamiliar jargon. This clinical focus, while necessary for treatment, can disconnect individuals from their sensory experience, emotional expression, and sense of agency, leaving them feeling detached from the very bodies that are the site of their healing. In this way, hospitals are a good example of how abstract systems expressed in institutional routines, if unbalanced, can unintentionally dissociate people from their embodied, lived reality. Institutions necessarily rely on norms like professionalism, consistency, and adherence to procedure. These structures can protect both individuals and the larger community and ensure fairness, safety, and efficiency. However, when institutional norms become rigid or are applied without discernment, they risk suppressing the emotional realities of the people involved. A patient's fear, a student's confusion, or an employee's grief can be labeled as disruptions rather than signals needing response. The dialectical challenge is to balance institutional order with human responsiveness, to uphold shared standards while remaining attentive to the emotional and relational needs that make us human. Emotional expression need not threaten institutional integrity. In fact, it can inform and humanize it. Socially, institutions depend on defining roles and categories to coordinate complex tasks and ensure fairness. But there's a risk that these roles, when rigidly applied, can overshadow the individuality and humanity of the people they're meant to serve. A person becomes a case, a patient, or a number in a system, rather than a unique individual with a particular story, context, and set of needs. This role-based lens narrows the relational field. Interactions become transactional, scripted, or procedural rather than genuinely relational. Policies, while designed for consistency and protection, can act as filters that block the subtle, real-time feedback that comes from human connection, like noticing a person's fear in their eyes or hearing the hesitation in their voice. When the institution's rules and categories take priority over human engagement, people may feel unseen, unheard, or reduced to their utility within the system. The challenge is to preserve institutional structure and fairness while staying open to the spontaneous, human moments that remind us we're not just dealing with roles, but with living beings. In terms of dissociation from context, institutions can become insulated from the systems they serve. When a health institution no longer serves health, or an educational institution no longer fosters learning, this is a failure of feedback. Self-preservation has taken priority over purpose, and like all reified systems, institutions often resist the intuitive knowledge that something is off until the system breaks. I've only spoken about 4 human inventions made possible by the abstract thinking of the large human brain. This has been merely the tip of the proverbial iceberg. My invitation to you is to investigate and think about the many other inventions that human beings have come up with. Consider them in terms of both advantages and risks, and consider doing this in the context of the evolutionary path of cognitive development, from sensory motor to emotional to social intelligence. And again, what I'm offering is itself a product of abstract thinking, so it runs the risk of reification and dissociation. So again, hold it lightly. It's also important to remember that each of these human inventions never operate in isolation. They interact, creating outcomes far greater than the sum of their parts, for better and for worse. Money drives scientific research and technological development, but it can also steer them toward profit for its own sake, or ideology over truth and human well-being. Science and institutions together can produce systems like hospitals that save lives or alienate us from our own bodies. This is what I'd call toxic synergy, when separate inventions, each powerful on their own, combine in ways that deepen dissociation from life and its needs. It's not only individual inventions we must examine, but also how they combine, reinforce one another, and create a whole greater than the sum of its parts, for better or worse. Each of my examples is an invitation for your own curiosity, not a conclusion. The point is not to reject the screen, abolish money, distrust science, or dismantle institutions. The point is to see how their abstract power can become disconnected from the living systems we ultimately need them to serve, and that disconnection, that dissociation, can creep in unnoticed unless we stay in touch with our bodies, our feelings, our relationships, and the living world around us, as well as the subtle implicit knowing that arises before words and ideas. This is what it means to stay aligned with life, not to escape abstraction, but to root it in the soil of our evolutionary intelligence, and to remember that life itself was here long before we made a map for it. That's all I have to say for now. I'll continue to explore this theme in future videos, and I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other, and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.